Hello, everybody. Welcome to the 9th event in our Outcomes Estimation Tools Training webinar series. And this time we're featuring the SIPES method, Social Indicator Planning and Evaluation System, and the SIDMA tool, the Social Indicator Data Management and Analysis tool. Thank you for being here today. I'm Michelle Perez, the Water Initiative Director for American Farmland Trust, and I'm joined by my colleague, Water and Soil Health Scientist Aisha Tapp-Ross. For those of you who don't know, American Farmland Trust is a national nonprofit founded in 1980. Our mission is to save the land that sustains us by 1, protecting farmland, 2, promoting sound farming practices, and 3, keeping farmers on the land and preparing the next generation of farmers. So today, after a few reminders and a quick poll to see who's in the room, we'll hear from Glenn O'Neill, environmental scientist and GIS specialist with the Institute of Water Research at Michigan State University, and Ken Genskow, professor and extension specialist with the University of Wisconsin-Madison, who will present on the SIPES method and SIDMA tool. They will first lead us in a presentation on the method and tool, and then a demonstration of the SIDMA tool. We'll have reserved the last 20 minutes of this webinar for Q&A. And of course, I want to thank our funders, the EPA Office of Water, the Walton Family Foundation, and the Mosaic Foundation for making this webinar series possible. All right, I'll turn it over to Aisha.
Okay, well, now for some quick housekeeping reminders. We are using the Zoom webinar platform for the series. So that means as attendees, you will have your camera and microphones turned off throughout the event. You can use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen at any time to ask questions, and the speakers will answer the questions during the last 20 minutes of the event. You can use your name or be anonymous when asking the questions or making comments. If you would like a question that somebody else has asked, you can vote it up so it can be prioritized. And we also do have the capability to unmute you. So please indicate in the question if you would like to ask it yourself. If you're having any technical difficulties, you can direct message me and I can try to help you. And then following each webinar, you will receive an email within 3 to 4 days that will provide the recording and the slides for the presentations, as well as information about the next month's speaker. And by the following Monday, we will post the recordings to the webinar registration page, which we absolutely welcome you to share with colleagues and friends that may be interested in viewing. And in a moment, I'm going to be sharing some links with you to the webinar slides and resources. And I'll also be sharing a link to an 8-question anonymous evaluation survey that you should take about 2 minutes to complete. The survey will pop up when you leave the webinar, but you can also click on it now so it opens in a new tab on your browser. We ask that you please complete the survey right after the event ends. Our presenters and the AFT team rely on these surveys to help inform our next month's speaker and any changes that we might need to make to the webinar series itself. Given the low survey participation rate in the past, we are now offering an incentive, which we started a few months ago. Everyone who fills out a survey today before 6 p.m. Eastern will be entered to win a $25 Visa gift card. The winner will be notified by email tomorrow morning, and we absolutely appreciate your participation and wish you luck in the drawing.
Thanks, Aisha. So Aisha's going to share those 2 links with you shortly, and then when she's done, we'll get ready for the polls.
Okay, well, we can go ahead and do the polls.
Excellent.
I will launch the poll. All right, so go ahead, Michelle.
All right, so we've got the same 3 questions. So we just want to know who's in the room. So which one sector below best describes your occupation? Are you associated with governments, the USDA, EPA, state soil water conservation districts, nonprofits like farm trade associations, environmental groups, others, academic associations, university or extension? Are you with a corporation or a sustainability program, environmental markets developer, or other? Thanks for answering those. Number 2 question is, if there is only 4 types of audience members, which one best describes you? Are you a developer of outcomes estimation tools, methods, or models? Are you a current user of those tools, methods, and models, a potential future user, or a person just generally interested in learning about outcomes estimation tools and issues? And our third and final question for the poll is, what is your experience level with the SIPES method and SIDMA tool? You've had not heard of it. You heard of it, but never used it. You've heard of it and used it. And the last one is, I refer to it often. Let's see, how are we doing on participation rate? Oh, it's pretty nice. Not yet 100%, but thank you. What do we try to get to?
We try to get to over 90%.
Great. Oh, thank you.
All right. So we're going to go ahead and end the poll.
Right. All right. The results are, you're mostly with the government agency side of things, about 72%, then followed by NGOs, 21%, one corporation or environmental markets developer, and one person who said other. So nobody from at the academic world. That is surprising. That's a little different. You are mostly folks who are generally interested in learning about methods and tools. You are also equally potentially a future user, and some of you, 1 in 5, maybe 1 in 3, are current users. That's pretty cool. And we have some developers of tools. Number 3, you've had not heard of it, mostly 66% of you, and 34% had heard of it and never used it. Excellent. We're getting to the right people with this webinar. I love that. All right, so moving on to the last slide here. So we're thrilled, I love to see this, which is the SALSA registration page is what I'm showing you, the progression of all these tools. Here we are, December 6th. That was the previous webinar. You can access that recording as well as the slides by clicking on that link. And then let's see what we have next in our schedule. Next month, we are going to feature the first Wednesday of every month, right? So this was a little bit odd because of the, closeness to the holidays. We pushed it back a week, but now we're back on the first Wednesday of every month when Peter Woodbury with Cornell will present the fertilizer and soil tool designed to help quantify greenhouse gas emissions, or fondly known as the FAST GHG tool. We hope you attend that event. And we're also very excited to announce a new addition to our training. On April 3, we will have a critical source area identification and management training, because that was a topic that many of you who completed the needs assessment survey at the beginning of this webinar series, you showed an overwhelming interest in. So please join that event to hear from 3 speakers: Shannon Phillips with the Water Quality Division of the Oklahoma Conservation Commission, Tate Wentz, the Water Quality Division Manager of the Arkansas Department of Agriculture, and Leif Kienberg. He is the Director of the Illinois River Watershed Partnership. All right. So I think with that's about it, right, Aisha? We're going to turn it over. Yep. I'm going to stop sharing and ask Ken Genskow to begin sharing his screen, and they're going to take it away. Thanks, Ken and Glenn.
All right, are you seeing a screen in a presentation mode?
Almost. Now it is in presentation mode. Excellent.
Great.
All right. Well, thank you, Michelle, and thank you, Aisha, for the opportunity to share the work that Ken and I have done over the years on the SIPES method and SIDMA. We're looking forward to sharing our work with you today, and look forward to getting some feedback from you. All right, so go ahead, Ken. So as Michelle introduced us, we'll each provide a bit more background. So I'll go first. My name is Glenn O'Neill. I work at the Institute of Water Research at Michigan State University as an environmental scientist and GIS specialist. We included some logos here from our pasts. So I got my undergraduate degree in education and GIS from the University of Maryland at College Park. And my first job after college was that little devil logo there. That was Montgomery Blair High School in Silver Spring, Maryland. I was a Blair Blazer there, where I taught for a number of years, mainly in social studies, but I also developed a GIS elective for high school students that I taught. And that was a number of years ago. GIS looks a lot different now. But after that, I switched gears a bit and went to work for Michigan State University, where I also started graduate school and ended up getting my PhD in geography in 2016. But I've been there for almost 20 years now, working for IWR, including on one or more projects with Ken. Ken, I'll let you provide your background.
Thanks, Glenn. And again, thanks, Aisha and Michelle, for the introductions. I'm Ken Genskow. I'm a professor and extension specialist at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I'm in the Department of Planning and Landscape Architecture, and my work primarily focuses around environmental policy and planning with a heavy emphasis on water. And as you can tell from the symbols there, I did my undergraduate work at University of Illinois in general engineering, went on into the Peace Corps, where I served in Nepal for 3 years, and then added master's degrees from the University of Illinois in urban and regional planning, and from UW-Madison, a PhD in urban and regional planning as well, and have been with Extension and UW-Madison since the early 2000s. So happy to be talking with you today.
All right, so for our agenda today, probably a good idea to start explaining some acronyms, since these are an acronym-heavy title for our presentation here. But SIPES refers to the Social Indicator Planning and Evaluation System. It's a method and an approach, and Ken will talk in depth about that. SIDMA is a tool that complements SIPES. It's a social indicators data management and analysis tool, and I'll talk mainly about that after Ken's presented on SIPES. So I will provide an introduction and overview for both of those, including their definitions, a snapshot of their overall functionality and their strengths and limitations. Ken will talk in depth about SIPES. I'll talk about the components of SIDMA and highlight some projects that have utilized both SIPES and SIDMA in the past to administer their watershed-related projects. We'll highlight some training resources that are available for both of those, and we'll end with a more in-depth demo. The components presentation, I'll go over the main functions of SIDMA, but the demo will go into a bit more depth and highlight what you can do with that tool. And as Aisha and Michelle mentioned, we'll take some Q&As at the end.
All right, well, I get to take over from here, and I'll just add to that, we're aiming to wrap up the formal presentation part around the top of the hour, so we'll have plenty of time for Q&A at the end. We'll see how if we're overly ambitious with that or not. So the starting question, what are we talking about when we're talking about social indicators? You probably heard them in common use in different settings. Generally, they are measures that provide information about the human condition, about people, really tied to specific policy goals or objectives. So you commonly see examples about education, employment, health. Think of the Global Sustainable Development Goals and the indicators that are tied into those kinds of issues. We're using them for conservation initiatives in a way that are measures that provide information about people that are tied more to goals, policy goals tied to improved environmental conditions. So what we'll be talking about today are primarily things like individual awareness, attitudes towards different issues, constraints faced by people, their capacity for change, and behaviors. And then SIPES or SIDMA, you've already seen these acronyms a couple of times now, so we'll just reinforce this. SIPES is the system. It's the Social Indicators Planning and Evaluation System. This is what we've designed for incorporating social indicators into the overall planning and evaluation of conservation and watershed management projects that have goals for improving or protecting the environment. And SIDMA, again, the Social Indicators Data Management and Analysis tool. It's an online tool that assists people in processing this social data that we use in the approach. And it includes a series of customizable questionnaires, a way for data entry and survey delivery, analysis, and other things tied into the social information that feeds into the system. This whole system and this whole project emerged in the early 2000s, 2005, 2006, and it was designed in cooperation with colleagues at US EPA Region 5 and other land-grant universities, as you see listed across the bottom there, really to help evaluate non-point water quality management efforts in the region. I guess I'm repeating myself with that second bullet there, but you can see who was involved. We had a series of pilot projects after the initial development phase that lasted up until 2011, and a handbook that we'll be highlighting later, I think was published in 2011. And the initial purpose was really to make sure that that grant-funded projects that were funded through EPA 319 projects through the states were able to incorporate social indicators into their evaluation. And the idea is that it would complement existing data that they already had, measuring what we were referring to as administrative and environmental indicators. And I'll go through all of this in more detail as we move ahead. But the approach uses a variety of social science data collection tools, including surveys, interviews, and other data that would be used for planning. This is a snapshot that you're familiar with. I think this is the basic format that's been used throughout this series. There's a lot here, so I'm not going to go through this in great detail. It'll be available with the slides following the presentation, but we put it in here as kind of a one-page overview of how this fits in with the other tools. It's intended to work at a watershed level. So it's social indicators within a watershed where there's a project focusing efforts of conservation staff. The outcomes are tied into changes in awareness, attitudes, capacity, behaviors that are intended to advance towards water quality improvement. And it encompasses really any conservation practice you can imagine that you're trying to get people to consider or try or adopt in the management of a landscape, whether it be urban or rural, which is the next part, applicable in both of those areas. It really is useful anywhere. It's designed for the US, so those are the kind of that's the language that's built into it, and it's variable on how much time, data, and skills it might require. It's really, our intention was to design it in a way that somebody not well versed and not especially familiar with social science methods could use this for a project that they're leading in a watershed. But for more advanced uses, often users have partnered with universities or NGOs or others who are more familiar with these areas. And then just a special note at the bottom there, it's going through a little bit of a modernization, and we'll talk about that as we get going here too. What are the strengths and limitations of the tool? Before we really get into the details of what the tool is, the strengths are that the process is vetted and it has a really clear guidance handbook for project managers. So our intention, again, with the handbook and with some other training materials, are that someone could pick this up and have a pretty good understanding of what they need to do to collect the information, analyze that information, and use it for their planning and evaluation. Lays out clear steps with a rationale for those steps, and it integrates with the EPA 9 key element watershed planning and implementation process. There'll be a slide on that later as well. Also includes a number of helpful references and examples that new users can draw from as they start their own experience. The limitations, as mentioned earlier, the guidance is aging a little bit now, so it has that look and feel to it. We could improve on some of the online survey integration that was emerging at the time, but not quite as available and useful as it is now. And then it's lacking some of the detail that we'd hope to flesh out about actually working with watershed organizations to apply the information. SIDMA, which again is the tool, has strengths that it's free to use. It's available for anybody. Not very many conservation or water quality tools focus on social indicators, and this one does. So that's an advantage. There aren't really any geographic limitations to where this can be used. And it's based on this really large set of vetted questions that can be customizable for the needs of a particular conservation area or watershed or other uses. Limitations, again, some of the areas are customizable, some are not. There's this inability to import survey data if the survey wasn't generated within the system or run through the system, but I think that's something that might be addressed in the future. As I mentioned with the guidance too, it looks like it's from 2011, 2012, and it's got a limited capacity for some spatial analysis. All right, so again, more about why we developed this in the first place and where it came from. The need, as we understood it in about 2005, was for EPA and the state agencies to have a better ability to focus the planning and evaluation efforts of the projects they were funding through EPA 319 programs. Those were focused on reducing diffuse or non-point sources to improve water quality. And at that point, they were collecting a lot of information about the environment. For example, what were the nutrient levels, what loads were being added, other general water quality parameters, soil health, for example, in the constituents of that. They were collecting a lot about what the projects were doing, the administrative indicators, the numbers of plans written, of newsletters, of participants, of fencing installed, et cetera. But what they were wanting was something more. So the response was this idea of using social indicators to provide information about how the programs were actually influencing people to adopt behavior change and practices that would be expected to lead towards water quality improvement. And where do you start when you're talking about behavior change? There are many theories about people and behavior, and you're probably familiar with some of these just from common public press or media. But I'm just going to highlight a couple of them here that help feed what we did for the SIPES system. The first one that I'll talk about briefly is the theory of planned behavior. This has been around a long time by Isaac Eisen. It starts on the right, thinking that if someone actually is going to take some kind of action, if they're going to have a behavior, they first have to have some level of intent for that behavior. And that behavioral intent is influenced by three main categories of things. How do they feel about that behavior? Do they think it's worthwhile? Do they think it's effective, et cetera? What do the other people think about that behavior, the social norms? If they do this thing, what will others think of them? And then the third area of perceived behavioral control is, do they really have the ability and capacity to do that behavior? So the theory is that those things have to line up. There's another element that was added later, that they actually have to have the ability to do the behavior as well, not just perceived, but actual behavioral control. So that's broadly the theory of planned behavior, which has influenced some of our thinking. Many of you may have heard of Everett Rogers, who was active with a theory called diffusion of innovations. And he talked a lot about this iterative process that starts with, before you can act, first you have to have some basic knowledge of the action. There's a persuasion phase that's usually a self-persuasion, this analysis of, is this going to be worthwhile for me? Should I do it? Some kind of a decision, an act of implementation, and then eventually confirmation. And this is about not just doing an action one time, but changing a practice that might stick. So changing the way you manage your landscape, for example. A third and very similar approach is the stages of change by Prokaska and others. And this is for, it's used a lot in the public health sector for changing behaviors, think smoking or obesity prevention efforts. There's this issue again of pre-contemplation, similar to knowledge, about really not even being aware of something, but aware that some action might be out there that you're searching for. Contemplation for a specific action, preparation for the actual action, and then again, maintenance. So you see this idea that it's not a one-off single decision. People go through the process, and sometimes it's iterative. They might consider something and go back to a previous stage and move on. Also, we all change and make decisions at different rates and different paces. You think about the adoption of a new telephone, back when the iPhone was first introduced, or other similar kinds of technologies. Rogers was talking about this issue called a diffusion curve, which talks about the rate at which a particular practice or a behavior is adopted, or a new technology makes its way through society, and who it is who actually leads the way and who follows. So you may have heard these terms before about the innovators, the early adopters, all the way back to laggards, which isn't really as pejorative as it sounds. The idea is that there's always an early group that's out experimenting and exploring and looking for new technologies across the different sectors. They're not always the ones, though, that others look to for leadership. So when we're thinking about that social norm issue and what would other people think if I were to change my practice in this way, if I were to start driving a different car or using cover crops, for example, it's the innovators might try it out, but the early adopters, once they take it on, that tends to start others looking at it, and they tend to be leaders in the community. All right, other issues about why would someone change, and then what can help lead to a change. All that balancing of should I, shouldn't I, do I want to, kind of boils down to a couple of major questions. This might feel like common sense. First, is this action or behavior worth it for me? Is there appropriate motivation? And can I do it? And then if we're trying to persuade others to do this, for example, through conservation programs, it's important to think about their process in going through a decision, and also how we communicate information to them in a way that's going to be effective. So for example, instead of throwing 100 ideas at someone, think about what practices and changes are going to matter the most and focus on those. People are open to messages that are presented in different ways from different people, but we know that it's not just the message, but also the messenger that matters when we're talking about any kind of behavior change or belief or value, also how that's delivered. Is it pushed at somebody? Is it presented conversationally? You get the idea. And then for many, it's not just words and not just sharing facts. It's people have to see it and experience it. We are well entrenched in defending our belief system, so often an opportunity to try is helpful. And these will be also available in the PDFs, but two books that have been, one of them very new, the McCraney book there on how minds change, and the other one a bit older, that go into this in much more depth if you're interested for a really very accessible read on a lot more of these theories. All right, so a couple more elements. Our system, back to SIPES and SIDMA, also incorporates this notion of targeting, that it's important to target action for behavior change if we're trying to achieve environmental conservation goal. So the points here, the location of actions and practices matters. High impact behaviors that are in highly vulnerable landscapes can have a disproportionate impact on environmental quality or on water quality. And so we're encouraging projects who use this approach to focus on the areas of the greatest impact with a specific audience in specific geographic areas. In fact, within SIPES, before people can start using SIDMA, we ask them to answer these 4 questions about their particular project area. And these are framed for non-point source problems. They can also be adapted for conservation practices. But what are the specific problems that this project is trying to address environmentally? What are the critical areas that contribute to that problem, the geographic areas? Who are the target audiences for the problems that this project is addressing? Target audiences being those who influence and control the land management in those areas. And then specifically, what actions do you want this target audience to take regarding the non-point source or other conservation problems? So it requires some analysis in advance of using the social indicator system. It's not just generally collecting information about its audience, it's collecting information in a way that can help focus planning and lead to evaluation. Let me just lay out here then a summary of this that we're calling our theory of change. And we have, again, remembering that this was developed for state and federal programs, working with local projects, right? People working on a watershed or conservation initiatives. There are program activities that are funded with the ultimate goal, the policy goal of improvement and protection of the environment. We know that improvement and protection of the environment involves reducing environmental stressors, whether it's sediment loads, let's just stick with that. So some level of stressors, the nutrients involved in those things must be reduced in order to improve an existing problem, or if we're talking about protection, to prevent further degradation. Reduction in stressors relies on the use of conservation practices across these areas that we've talked about as critical landscapes. And we know that the use of conservation practices, the decision to adopt a practice, to try something or not, depends on a big bundle of different factors that we draw from theory about behavior change. These include things like those social norms, someone's skills, their values and knowledge, attitudes towards something, capacity, awareness, and constraints. And then ultimately, the program activities are trying to influence that bundle of factors for key individuals, assuming that these are delivered effectively. And that is what we're talking about with social indicators. Those green circles are the social indicators that we measure through the SIPES and SIDMA tools. And then just to reinforce again, when we talk about social indicators, we're talking about those various indicators in the middle that complement administrative indicators focused on program activities and environmental indicators that are traditional measures of environmental health and quality. All right, a couple more things. We're talking about using these in a way that advances particular goals and intended outcomes for an environmental purpose. So again, having developed these for a non-point source program with the understanding they're adaptable for other conservation initiatives, these are goals that would be tied back to those green circles that you just saw. So the goal would be to increase the target audience awareness, thinking of that target audience as the group that influences the critical areas of a watershed or a conservation initiative focus area that need to be doing something different. So the outcome of these efforts would be to increase the awareness of relevant technical issues or recommended practices in critical areas. think about back to those theories of change and progression. First, they must be aware of something, is the assumption here of what we're measuring, or at some stage in the process, they must be aware. So we're talking about indicators for these 4 elements related to awareness of the consequences of pollutants to water quality, awareness of the different types of pollutants that are impairing that water quality. And again, these are customizable somewhat for different conservation initiative needs. Awareness of the actual pollutant sources, so not just the types, but the sources of those things, and then awareness of appropriate practices they could use to improve water quality. Similarly, if we're talking about attitudes that they might have, this audience that we're trying to influence, first understanding what those are, but then generally trying to change attitudes that would facilitate desired behavior change. So attitudes about water quality related issues or conservation related issues, and then attitudes related to their willingness to take action, some kind of willingness to consider and act. And then other things like constraints. How do we reduce the constraints that interfere with their ability to actually take an action, whether it's financial, technical, access to equipment, know-how, social norms, the whole set of things that might be interfering with what they're doing. And then I'm going to skip to goal 5 here. Goal 5 is ultimately increasing their adoption of management practices. Back to those 4 questions, practices that we're focusing on through a particular program or project that we expect to lead ultimately towards an improvement in environmental condition. The capacity, organizational capacity, as I highlighted at the beginning, is one area where there's still some work that we want to do within this system. But we're trying to get a better sense of what is the overall ability of partners within a watershed area to work together to combine their technical resources to address these needs for individual change. All right, just one more here, I think, for me. The SIPES planning and evaluation cycle is a circular cycle, as you might often see with planning and evaluation cycles. Step 1 is that early part of understanding what it is that a project is trying to accomplish. So not just doing a general inventory of who's out here in the watershed, but thinking about, we have a plan, we have some intention, we have an environmental goal and objectives that we're trying to collect, and understanding and analyzing those first. That involves answering those 4 questions. And then the second step, step 2, is collecting and entering pre-project survey data. And this could be collected via interviews. It's just a structured questionnaire that guides the process of that. That data is analyzed through SIDMA, produces some information that can be reviewed and then incorporated into the project over a 5 or 10 year or 3-year window, however long this project is planning to continue. Or some projects just are always continuous, and so it's an iterative checking in and refining. Step 4 is monitoring social data throughout the project. So as things are being implemented, are these things changing? Are workshops being attended, for example? Are demonstrations, if they're part of a program, being attended? A combination of information that can help you monitor throughout a project. And then after the end of a project, again, collecting data. Step 6, entering all of this and doing some analysis. Step 7, reviewing, and then repeating for areas that are maybe for longer term projects. And then, as I highlighted in the beginning, this also fits with the EPA 9 key element watershed planning process, which we've illustrated here in the linear image on the right. And these tie up with this notion again of first having some sense of what the project plan is about. What are the physical and biological characteristics of the watershed, and what are the goals that are being targeted for work to lead to this ultimate environmental improvement? And the steps, as they're straightened out from the circle there, show the part that they match up to into that process. All right, that was very rapid, but maybe still too slow. And hopefully gives you enough of a foundation that we can switch now over to understanding the tool that we use to develop this. And I think this will help bring into focus some of those things that we're trying to do. All right, so I think, Glenn, you're going to try to share your screen here instead.
Yeah, how's it look?
It looks good.
Okay.
I just want to interrupt and say that was excellent. I really enjoyed that, Ken.
Great, thanks.
All right, yeah, thank you, Ken. So Ken laid out SIPES, and he's mentioned SIDMA. I talked briefly about SIDMA. So SIDMA is an online tool to kind of help administer that SIPES process, to collect and analyze social data for a particular area, a project, a watershed, a county, and evaluate changes over time. And so I'm going to provide a brief overview of SIDMA's core functionality and how some projects have utilized it. And then I'll come back with a more in-depth demo. I intended to do this demo live, but the internet in my area is tenuous right now. So we have some pre-prepared slides of the demo that I'm going to rely on just to avoid any potential issues that might come up. All right, so the key component in SIDMA to gather and analyze social information is through survey building. It allows you to build surveys, administer them, and analyze the results. And all those are organized around a project. You can create a project within SIDMA, create surveys, one or more within a project, and all that will contain the information that you would need for analyzing social indicators in your area. So surveys can be created from scratch, or they could be copied from another SIDMA project on the system. I'll provide a bit more detail on that in the demo later. And as Ken mentioned, there's a large database of questions that have been vetted from which you can build the surveys. They're organized around various categories, such as rating for water quality. And some categories have more options to choose from than others. So practices to improve water quality. This is a section of questions which survey authors can select to gauge their respondents' familiarity and the degree of current adoption of certain conservation practices. But whereas the previous rating of water quality just had 6 options to choose from, this one has 185 practices that you can evaluate. You don't have to include 185 in your survey. You identify the ones that are most relevant to your area or your project, but you have a large number to choose from. And the types of questions vary. The ones I've shown previously were more table structured, tabular in nature. The survey also has more direct questions. There's a section called About You that asks specific questions about the individual respondent. And there are other types of questions that take on this kind of direct question structure that also can include open-ended text responses. We mentioned previously there's ability to add custom questions to that database of questions that you can choose from to tailor your survey. Again, I'll provide some more detail on this in the demo to show exactly what that looks like on the system. So once a survey's been built, the next step is to administer the survey, and there are a couple ways that can be done. You can generate a public URL that could be shared as part of an information campaign, or you can manually input responses within SIDMA itself. And again, the demo will dive into a bit more detail about those. But once the survey's been administered and results have been gathered and stored on the system, then comes the survey analysis portion. And there are a couple different ways that you can analyze the data. Question by question on the survey, you can look at response frequency data, including the percentages of responses, and also statistical analyses of the mean scores for each question. Most of the questions on the survey have some type of numeric score tied to each value, and so that allows us to calculate some statistical information. And there are options for viewing these results in the way you see here, in a table format or also graphically as well. And so that's a question by question analysis of survey response. And then there are the indicators, which Ken had talked about. So the system will look at the group of questions related to and tied to different indicators and calculate indicator scores. You see an awareness indicator here alongside an attitudes indicator. These also can be viewed graphically, but the text on the the system also includes some instructions on how to interpret this. So for example, this particular indicator, the awareness of types of pollutants impairing waterways, can range anywhere from 1 to 2, 1 meaning less aware of the types of pollutants impairing waterways, up to 2, which is more aware. So we can see a mean score, and when I come back to this in the demo, some additional instructions on how to interpret and evaluate indicator scores. There's also the ability to compare surveys against each other. So in the context of a pre-survey administered before a program, either an outreach program or an implementation project, and then a post-survey administered sometimes later, you can track progress. You can do that both with the response frequencies, question by question, or comparing the indicator scores themselves for each of the individual indicator categories. And those can be evaluated for their statistical significance to see if there is a meaningful difference between one group before a project or after a project. So I'll now highlight some of the work that's been done by other groups on SIDMA. So there have been over 200 surveys that have been generated through SIDMA. Those have collected over 39,000 responses, and those are individual respondents who've submitted surveys through SIDMA, and those have covered roughly 20 states. Now, I mentioned at the outset there have been some coming updates to SIDMA. We've made some in support of the work with American Farmlands Trust. We had some opportunity to enhance the mapping functions of SIDMA, and so one of the things we added here was this map tab, which allows you to view the watersheds in which SIDMA projects have been created on the site. And so you get a sense of the distribution of the projects. They've mostly been clustered in the Great Lakes region, as Ken mentioned on the history slide about where this project originated. So that's been much of the focus, but it has been picked up by other groups in other parts of the country, and you can see that expansion here in that slide, and you can view it on the website itself. So to highlight a few of these projects, this map also allows you to click on a particular watershed and see the SIDMA projects that have been tied to or associated with a particular watershed. One of the ones I'll highlight here is the Tip of the Mitt Watershed Council up in Lake Charlevoix in northern Michigan. They've utilized SIDMA for their watershed management planning. In 2010, they were developing a management plan for the lake, and that was by the Tip of the Mitt Watershed Council in partnership with MSU Extension. They developed 3 different surveys, one for residents, one for shoreline property owners, and one for local officials, and administered a pre-survey, and then did it again 10 years later after various outreach activities and planning efforts. And they were able to document increased awareness of water quality threats and the willingness to implement conservation amongst their different audiences, and they all did that through SIDMA. Another project, another Michigan one, was the Plaster Creek Stewards Project. This is near Grand Rapids in the Grand River Basin. The Plaster Creek Stewards and DataWise, a data analytics company, used SIDMA to evaluate outreach efforts in the watershed. From 2014 to 2022, they administered multiple surveys to 2 different groups, people who participated in their outreach activities and the general population. And what they observed in comparing those 2 groups was that outreach participants did have higher levels of awareness of water quality impacts and greater familiarity with water quality improvement practices, and were more likely to have implemented those practices. And so that was a way for Plaster Creek to evaluate the success of its outreach activities in that watershed. And then one more project to highlight, the Lower Kankakee Watershed Initiative. This is a more recent project. 2022, they utilized SIDMA to support the development of their watershed management plan. They administered an ag-focused survey and a more urban and suburban-focused survey within the watershed. And And their goal in utilizing SIDMA was to develop a baseline for how people feel about local water resources, how much they know about water quality concerns, the types of practices they adopt on the land they manage, and what factors affect their land management decisions. That was from their management plan. And again, they'll use this as a baseline for evaluating performance in the future. Now, these project profiles, we've also added a page within SIDMA that highlights these projects and provides links to their watershed management plans and some of their other materials, in addition to some other projects that I didn't profile here. But you can find all that on the SIDMA website. And in terms of training resources, the SIPES handbook, which Ken had referenced to, you can find and access through SIDMA. That's available in the Tools About page. There's also a video series that was developed a number of years ago when the system was initially developed to walk you through how to utilize the system. But that's still there and still available, in addition to a link to another webinar series on SIDMA that was developed as part of the Indiana Watersheds webinar series. So you can find all that linked on the SIDMA help page.
Okay, I found this on the web.
Okay, Siri apparently wanted to follow up on that as well. So. All right, so I'm gonna now walk through a more detailed demo of SIDMA. I provided the high-level overview of its core functionality, but I'll give you more of a window into what that looks like for those that haven't used it before. So you start on a home page and you start by creating a project. Again, everything in SIDMA is organized around a project. And you can create that project and it'll ask you some questions. You provide a name, an organization. You can select the watershed of interest, and it has a tool to help you identify a watershed and a HUC code. And it also asks you to describe the project in a bit more detail and some of the aspects of the project that Ken had described before. So, for example, have you identified your non-point source problem? Have you identified critical areas? Have you identified your target audience? So all that is captured in the project creation portion of SIDMA. But once the project's created, you have a project page, and all those details are listed there. And the next step is to add a survey to the project. And so you can create a new survey. When you do that, you're provided with all the questions that SIDMA has to offer you, and it asks you to select those. And there's a lot of blue italicized text, which will provide all the instructions you need. And I know we're all inclined to skip over instructions and just jump right into whatever a website wants us to do. But it is worthwhile to read the text and the instructions, because there is a lot that's going on in the background and with these question selections, and this explains it all in good detail here. So you start by selecting from that database of questions to build your survey. And once you've done that, it moves you to a second section. So one of the decisions you make are which practices that you want to include in your survey, the practices you want to gauge your audience's familiarity with or the extent of adoption. And so in the demo here, I'd selected, out of those 185 practices that I'd showed previously, I'd selected 16 of them. And it asks me to pick a handful, a subset of these, to include in a more detailed section of the final survey. So of these 16 practices, of which I want to get some, I want to gauge my audience's familiarity with, I'm particularly interested in the ones that I selected here: no-till to reduce erosion, and the use of cover crops for erosion protection and soil improvement. And those two will get, the other 14 will show on the survey just like they show here, but these two will get a more in-depth treatment, which I'll show in a moment. So once I've done that, I can view the survey by clicking, I now have the survey in my project page here. It's listed here. I can click the view button and see exactly what the survey would look like to a respondent. And there are some options here that are available. So if the survey was administered online, this is what it would look like. This is what the respondent would be filling out. But we've had some projects that have wanted to administer paper surveys. They wanted to take the survey offline, perhaps put some graphics or some other branding on it themselves, and administer it in a paper format. And so there's an option to view it in a Word-friendly format that could be copied and pasted into a Word document and edited as needed. So I'd mentioned those specific practices that we're going to get a different treatment on the final survey. This is what those look like. So with regards to no-till, it gets its own section on the survey. So we're not just asking how familiar are you with this practice, which is what that initial table was gauging, and what the other 14 questions I didn't select as key questions. That's all that's being asked of them. But with regards to no-till, we ask some follow-up questions. If the practice isn't relevant, we give them an open-ended question to explain why. We ask if they're willing to try the practice. And most importantly, we try and gauge what are the constraints that are limiting their ability to adopt this practice. Is it a function of their familiarity with it? Is it a time function? Is it because of its cost or a lack of equipment? And so this is how that particular question is presented on the survey, and it gives us an opportunity to gather more information about it. Okay, so the survey's been created. I've taken a look at it to see what it looks like. And now perhaps I want to edit it some more, make some changes to that. So on that survey management page, I can click edit, and I'm presented again with the list of all the questions that SIDMA has to offer, and I can select and deselect some options to change what's on the survey. But I also have the ability to add some custom questions outside of that existing core database of questions that SIDMA offers. And so if I click on that add or edit custom questions, I'm presented with a page that looks like this, which allows me to either add a question to an existing table. So that first category, the rating of water quality, I could add an option here to those 6 options listed there. I also have the ability to add my own set of questions, add my own table. So for example, if I wanted to add a new table of questions here, it would allow me to do that. And I provide an example here. So I have a new table header. How would you rate the quality of water for each of the following? I have my options of answers that I'll present to the users. And all these are tied back to some type of numeric value so that we can calculate statistics with regards to the responses. And I have my 4 options that I want to include in this table. So I provided four mid-Michigan water bodies that I want to gauge the respondents' rating of water quality for. And so when I go back to view the survey to see how my edits have changed, I now see that I have a whole new section here for those 4 water bodies, and it asks this question. So that's one way in which I can customize the survey through SIDMA. And these are done one category at a time. So I did that for rating of water quality. If I wanted to edit another category, I'd go back through the editing page and would select that option for that category. All right, and so the next step, I've created my survey and I've edited it. The next step is to select key questions. This is to identify particular components of the survey that are most important or relevant for my project, and those are utilized in the indicator score calculations. So if you click the select key questions option, it presents you with a subset of relevant questions on the survey and asks you to identify which of these are key or most important. You're welcome to select all of them if desired, but you can discriminate on certain questions that are most relevant that should be factored into the calculation of the indicator scores. All right, so then with regards to the survey administration, we've built our survey, we've edited it, we've identified our key questions, and now we want to gather the responses. There are a couple different ways we can do that. I'd mentioned the public survey URL. This generates a unique URL that you could then tie to a bit.ly or some other URL masking service that makes it a more digestible URL. But this creates a unique access point for the survey that makes it harder for spamming purposes. Alternatively, if you have paper responses that you've gathered, you can manually input the responses within SIDMA itself. But once responses have been submitted, and the screenshot here shows that my survey now has 10 responses in it, then I can start to review the response frequencies and start to do some of the analysis. So I have, for rating of water quality, I can see the percentage response for each option. I can see the statistical data. I can sort these tables. Clicking on these arrows will, for a particular column, will sort and rearrange the table accordingly. That's useful for some of the tables that might have 20 or more questions, and you want to see which particular question was rated poorly for a particular criteria, or good, or had a high mean score. You can view graphs for each question by clicking on the text. And you can also view the indicator scores. And we've shown this previously in the overview, but I'll go into a bit more detail here. When you're looking at the indicator scores, you can click on the text here and it will show you how the indicator score was calculated, what portions of the survey SIDMA is pulling from to estimate, in this case, the awareness of types of pollutants impairing waterways, what questions were utilized, how they were scored, and how they ended up calculating the indicator score that you see there. All right, and if you want to download and analyze your data yourself offline, there's the ability to download data. This presents the responses for a survey in a tab delimited format that you can copy and paste into a text file and then open in a spreadsheet and do offline analysis. So that's available here. The data here is organized into columns. Each column is a question, and each question has its own unique variable name, such as WQ boat and WQ eat fish. To know what that means, there's an option to edit variable names on a survey, and that will show you your survey along with the associated variable names tied to each individual question, some of which you can edit if they're questions that you customized and added yourself. All right, and so we developed a pre-survey. We gathered responses. Let's assume that we had implemented our project. Perhaps it was an outreach campaign around water quality issues in our watershed. Some time has passed, and we want to do a post-survey and see if we've observed a change. So there's some tools within SIDMA that will help you do that. One of those is the Copy SIDMA Survey button, which will allow you to select a project within SIDMA and a survey within that project to copy into your project. It could be from any project, but typically what you would do is you might take your pre-survey that you'd already generated and collected responses on and create a new survey and just call it post-survey. And so now I have two surveys in my project, the original pre one and the post one, which copied over everything from the pre one, including the questions I selected to include in the survey, the custom questions that I created, the key questions that I identified, all the variable names, all that gets copied over except the response information. It doesn't copy over the responses that were on the pre-survey. So you have a fresh, clean post-survey with which to administer and gather information. And once you've done that, so in the demo here, I now have 10 responses for my post-survey. I can compare the surveys against each other to see how they've changed. And I can do that in two different ways. I can look at the response frequencies between the two surveys or the indicator scores. And if we look at the response surveys, we get a question by question breakdown, option by option breakdown between the two surveys. And it's really just a simple subtraction. Again, we have our blue italicized text to help us understand what we're looking at here. But in a nutshell, We take the score, the response frequency for one survey, and our example here, the post survey, and we subtract the associated value on the pre-survey. So the way we'd interpret that is that for this particular question, how would you rate the quality of water in your area for picnicking and family activities? Our mean score on the post survey was 1.1 higher than on the pre-survey, which makes sense because there's 60% more respondents on the post survey rated it higher, or rated it good, I should say, than on the pre-survey. And you can look at that analysis option by option across the survey. So that's what you can do with the response frequencies. With the indicator scores, it'll do the same thing, indicator by indicator, looking at the score and calculating the difference between the two surveys. So it provides some additional text on how to interpret these. So for example, our first indicator, the awareness of the consequences of pollutants to water quality, a score of 0.56. That means the post-survey indicator score was 0.56 higher on the post-survey than on the pre-survey. And SIDMA will test for statistical significance in that result. And you can click the View Results button, and you'll see how the two surveys differed in terms of their indicator scores, in addition to providing some of the statistical documentation for how that determination was made. So just to summarize that demo there, I was trying to highlight how with SIDMA, you can create a survey, administer the survey, gather responses, and then fairly easily generate a post survey. And I don't want to imply that gathering the information is easy, but then gathering your information and comparing those surveys to track changes in social indicators over time. So if you have questions about SIDMA itself as you utilize it, there's my contact information. I'm the primary developer of SIDMA, and I handle all the bugs people find in it when they do. But it's been around for a while, so we've identified or handled most or nearly all of the bugs. And then questions about SIPES, Ken would be your best resource for that. And actually, before we pause, Ken mentioned some updates coming to SIDMA. We previewed some of them. We've expanded the mapping capabilities within SIDMA. But we do have some funding from EPA that by the end of the year, we're going to modernize the interface so it doesn't look like it came from 2008. And we're also going to add some functionality to import external survey data into SIDMA, which has been a need that a number of projects have had that we've worked with. So all that should be in place by the end of 2024. But nonetheless, I don't want you to have to wait that long to utilize it. We'll make the migration from the older system to the newer one as seamless as we can. But if you have questions while doing so, please use my contact info here.
Excellent. Well, thank you. That was really terrific too, Glenn. We have two questions so far. Well, one question and one kudos. Andrew Baru of EGLE said, I have to run to a meeting, but this was really great. Thank you so much, everyone. So others, don't be shy, get your questions in. So I'll just read out the question from Will Lytle, maybe with ESMC. Don't pretend to know everybody, but Will asked a great question. And maybe this was for Ken at the half-hour mark, do you recommend an iterative process for understanding which interventions are appropriate for the different groups of early, mid, and late adopters? The context constraints of laggards might be significantly different than that of early adopters and nonlinear.
Yeah, I'll take that one. Thanks, Will, for the question. I appreciate it. And yeah, it recognizes that issue that people are going to be adopting whatever we're encouraging them to do, if at all, right, at different stages. And I'm interpreting your interventions, meaning the approach that you would use to reach them, not necessarily the practices. I think the practices and what we're encouraging them to do would tie back into the overall goals of the project. And then, of course, people would be considering that at their own pace and with their own factors. But yes, you'll want to think about who those different audiences are and the variety of approaches needed to reach people with different levels of awareness, resistance, interest. And so I think at the beginning, it's hard to know who's going to be a skeptic, who's going to be eager. Even when you get the information back from this kind of a system, it doesn't really tell you how enthusiastic they are about this or how reluctant. So the general advice would be to use a kind of a broad array of approaches that include different methods of reaching out. And of course, this will vary depending on the size of your project area, the kind of thing you're trying to do. If it's a habitat project specifically, for example, you're going to be focusing in on people with potential habitat areas, and even finding more information about them beyond the survey is important. But things like demonstration projects are helpful. Attending small local meetings can be helpful. If there's, for some project area, a group of peer learners, for example, farmer-led watershed groups are prevalent in a number of the Midwestern states. Those are all great access points for that. Not sure if I've answered your question fully, but would be happy to expand on that or even follow up offline if you'd like to follow up.
Excellent, thank you. Second question has come in, really good question, from Marty. What has been the most innovative use of the platform, as you said, made for water non-point source work, but can be customized to many other conservation efforts? For instance, my organization is interested in grass-based perennial cover and wildlife habitat restoration in association with ag rural land management. So tell us about some pros and cons of writing new questions.
Glenn, you want to start that one?
Sure. I don't know if I'm qualified to evaluate what the most innovative use of the platform is. I know a number of projects have customized and tailored their surveys within SIDMA themselves, and I've collaborated with them in doing so. But again, I'm not sure how to evaluate which group was most innovative. The ones I highlighted in the slide deck here, I think have would be ones to look at. And again, they're accessible on the project highlights page, which we've added to the system. But for your specific interest in wildlife habitat, again, it's a large data bank of questions. And Ken, you might recall, since you helped come up with some of these questions, but are there habitat-related options built within those core questions already?
Yeah, there should be. We pretty much use the NRCS field guide, I think, and built practices for almost everything in there, plus other things that were being used by local projects.
So if you were interested in building a survey, I think you'd have stuff to utilize right out of the box. But again, you can tailor the survey and add, particular questions that might not be in there around wildlife habitat or grass-based perennial cover to the survey itself. So you have options.
And talk a little bit more about the cons of writing your own new questions, and might folks be able. And I'll ask my second follow-up question after you address that first question.
Oh, sure. Well, so the cons with adding custom-based questions. So there are some potential complications that would come with that. If you add a whole section, kind of like what I demonstrated there when I was focusing on specific water bodies, I'm able to add that to my survey, gather responses, and look at the response data. But the calculation of indicator scores are looking in specific sections of the survey. Not every question is going to feed an indicator score. And if I add a whole new just section that I want factored into the indicator scores, then SIDMA is not going to allow me to do that. I do have some ability to add questions to those existing categories where SIDMA is looking, and it will consider those new questions in the calculation of indicator scores, but that's something you'd have to be mindful of. Not everything you add is going to necessarily feed an indicator score that you're looking for.
Cool. So just to clarify, individual questions added to the already built-in sections will help produce the indicator score, but brand new questions outside of the custom sections won't get its own indicator score.
Correct, yeah.
Cool. All right. I guess my follow-up was, how much looking under the hood is there an opportunity for users? So, if they wanted to build their whole new section of 5 or more questions, can they learn how the tool does the math and program their own Excel-based file or another spreadsheet file to do the math for them and come up with similar analyses that are provided by the tool?
Yeah, and I don't want to sell the tool short, but it's pretty basic math that we're doing there. With the response frequencies, we're just calculating percentages, and all the way that numbers are scored, the way means are calculated, the values assigned to each option in a question. It's all accessible and transparent within SIDMA. So if someone wanted to replicate that offline, they could. With regards to the indicator scores, it's a little more complicated, but the math is still pretty straightforward. And as I demonstrated in the demo, for each indicator, you can see exactly where SIDMA's pulling questions from, how it's calculating scores, and yeah, that could be, you could replicate that yourself offline with some time and patience. But all the math and how things are coded and how SIDMA treats different questions are all it's all accessible and transparent on.
I would just add, if people are developing their own questions, just to make sure to run those questions through some kind of a vetting process themselves. It's easy to write questions that are then misunderstood. And one of the advantages of what we've done is we did a lot of testing to finesse the wording. But certainly people have added their own questions and have gone through that process with a small group. One other thing that I think came up earlier, some people will develop this survey online, download it, and then recreate it in another online survey delivery tool, Qualtrics or SurveyMonkey or something like that. And then they can just run the process themselves. And then Glenn mentioned at times he's been able to import that back into SIDMA for data analysis. But as you just pointed out, Michelle, someone else could just borrow or look at whatever is active behind the scenes and recreate something like that for themselves in Excel or some other statistical analysis package.
That was helpful. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll just add on to what Ken was saying. I have worked with some groups to import their Qualtrics data into SIDMA, but there's no Qualtrics button in SIDMA presently. That's all stuff that we've done offline in the back end. But our hope is that by the end of this year, we will have a process that will allow you to do that all within SIDMA itself.
Well, that's very exciting. Can people email you to get on a list to be notified when the new bells and whistles are ready?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. That sounds great.
Michelle, I'll add one more point to Marty's question earlier. One of the audiences that you can use this for, some of this, it's set up for urban or agriculture, but there's also this rural non-farm audience of landowners who might not be practicing agriculture, but might have land suitable for habitat improvement or other conservation goals. So just wanted to highlight that that also is an audience that would have its own kind of targeted outreach efforts, given the way they manage their land.
Very good. Yeah. Well, no other questions have come in. Don't be shy, folks. This is your time to get your questions out. We want to take advantage of these experts here. I can give people time and also have Aisha deliver her final slide. And so if folks want to, I'm going to share my screen now. If folks want to type in more questions, please do while Aisha shares our final slide.
All right. Well, thank you, Michelle, and thank you, Glenn and Ken. And thank you, everyone, for participating in today's webinar. Here are some next steps in our collective outcomes quantification journey. So first, we look forward to you joining us at some or all of the next set of tools training webinars that will be held on the first Wednesday of every month. If you can't make it to one or more of the webinars, but want to view the session, the recording should be available by the following Monday. Second, at the end of the webinar, please share your feedback with us by answering that quick 8-question survey. I'm sharing the link again. And I did share the link at the beginning of the session as well. It will also appear as a new tab in your internet browser when the webinar ends. So please take a couple of minutes to share your feedback so we can keep improving these events. And don't forget that you'll also be entered into a drawing for a gift card just for filling out the survey. We want to thank you in advance for your participation and good luck. Also, Michelle and I are offering free coaching services to 6 farm project managers who secure a session with us. These sessions are individually tailored to you in order to help you figure out which tools or methods are right for your project. If you're interested, just email me, Aisha Tapp-Ross, and in the subject line, write coaching sessions. And finally, if you'd like a free print copy of the guide to be mailed to you, you can place that order online at the report website, which you can easily find using keywords AFT Outcomes Tools. So thank you again for your participation, and we look forward to seeing you on February 7th.
Great. Well, look at that. Excellent. Will Lido wrote another question. Is there a way to incorporate more theories of practice into these tools? The balance between qualitative and quantitative data has been important for my organization.
I guess
I can't answer that.
Yeah, I think I'd want to talk a little bit more with Will about what you're thinking, and would be happy to do that. Maybe just a quick follow-up. I know you're limited to your keyboard. Certainly we could draw from different theories of change and behavior change ideas. A lot of them, as I highlighted in those 2 books, tend to be focusing in on a few key traits, but as I mentioned in our earlier overview, there are things that we just had to focus on because of the limitations of our own approach. For example, specific knowledge and skills. We're not really going out and testing whether someone actually has the skill to do something. That might be something that would be helpful through some other kind of an outreach intervention. So I would say that we're drawing from that, but maybe not explicitly addressing it. That could be the kind of a customized question if you're working with a small group and you could figure out some way to assess, specific skills. We do ask about that as a constraint for some of the practices in that section that Glenn highlighted. So I'm just riffing there, but yeah. Will, you have my email at the end of the slides, and I think those will be available for download today. Is that right?
Yeah, and Aisha read my mind and gave Will the chance to say more. Will, go ahead.
Yeah, I think, I'm just coming off of a project that was looking at the innovations of the food, energy, water nexus system. And what we were finding, we had both teams working on interviews and, qualitative data, and then surveys and quantitative data. And a lot of times we were running into issues where, these are complex decision-making scenarios where the person that you're surveying may not be the sole decision maker. They may not have, ownership over the whole process. And, there's certainly really important data that we yield from the surveys, but it doesn't always jive with like the lived experience of the producers or the consumers. And so, like working for ways to tie, sometimes the open-ended questions would be so useful for being able to restructure the survey in order to identify, it's like they're kind of in their bubble, and allowing them to think outside their bubble sometimes provides new types of interventions. I think a lot of times and I appreciate that the surveys are identifying their perceptions of their ability or their situation. But that, yeah, the context is so complicated that a lot of times we're driving with the intervention is education or more information, where a lot of times they just have a limited capacity to enact these changes, or competition or collaboration could be much more powerful social interventions for making the practice changes happen. But like you said, the recognition that the local lens, the local context context, the high impact activities differ between regions. Sometimes, yeah, just that balance between the surveys versus the focus groups. And I think that recommendation to go to local meetings, kind of speak offline sometimes can really help leapfrog for, groups that are working to operationalize their findings as a valuable note.
Yeah, thanks, Will. Appreciate that additional information. And as you're pointing out, there are a lot of good ways to collect this information. And at its most basic level, I think the categories and the goals can be used to structure qualitative conversations with people before you even structure a formal questionnaire, right? I think you're implying that too. And you could limit the level of detail that you put into a questionnaire. I mean, you could scratch out on a notepad those general areas and conversationally get a sense of where people in this target area are already and what some of their specific and unique needs might be. In fact, even for purposes of planning or evaluation, that additional qualitative data can be helpful in reporting back to a funder, or just for yourself as a project manager, thinking about, okay, we tried this for this 3 years. What are we going to be able to do for the next 5 or 8 based on what we've learned? And certainly focus groups and interviews have so much more rich data than what you get from surveys. Surveys are great for collecting and aggregating a lot of information from a lot of people and for having that ability to quantify and compare. But it's really nice to complement that with those other approaches. So I'm glad you were able to do that. And it really does start to illustrate the complexity of specific situations.
Great. Well, thanks for that extra question, Will. Definitely taking advantage, and hopefully maybe you'll contact Ken or Glenn offline later. Well, thank you for staying with us to the just about very end here. I think we all learned a tremendous amount and really appreciated learning from both of you. Thank you so much. This was a great webinar, both of you.
Thank you, everybody. Appreciate you attending. And thanks again, Michelle and Aisha, for the opportunity.
Yeah, same. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, everyone, have a great day. See you next